Well, they're typically on the northern states, and then they also follow mountain ranges like the Rockies and Appalachians down into the southern states. But the reality is that that's a different habitat type. So yeah, that is in that state what those birds need. And so what works in northern Minnesota for a ruffed grouse doesn't necessarily what you need in, say, California, Oregon, Washington.
What is up, everybody? Mark on the mic, my good friend, Mr. Ryan Muckenhern to my right, and Meadow Kouffeld across from us virtually. Ryan, this might be your dream come true. We chat about grouse occasionally. You are a grouse fanatic. And we were talking about we should do a podcast about grouse. And you said, I have just the person. And that's Meadow.
Yes.
Meadow, welcome to the Vortex Nation podcast. We appreciate you joining us today. If you can, give us a rundown of who you are, your background, your business, things that you do, and then we're going to jump into all of our grouse questions.
Sounds good. Well, as you guys said, my name is Meadow Kouffeld. I'm here in Minnesota, so Grand Rapids, North Central. And originally I'm from California, but I've been here about 17 years. So I think this is actually my 17th year here. Moved to Minnesota for graduate school. It was where my best opportunities came from when I was looking into research opportunities. And it just so happened to be ruffed grouse that brought me to Minnesota. And so that was what my research thesis was based off of for my master's. It was actually habitat selection in north central Minnesota. So spent a fair amount of time studying birds, looking at a lot of different drumming logs, right around like 890 of them. And so I knew a lot about drumming logs. And then after that, I worked for Wisconsin DNR, Minnesota DNR, the Ruffed Grouse Society. I taught at the college here in town for a bit. And now I'm a senior ecologist at a consulting firm. So my career trajectory in wildlife, like most wildlife biologists, has been a lot of different positions and a lot of different skill sets that had to be developed. So in addition to that, I'm an outdoors person. I love to fish, hunt, always have. And that's a big part of the lifestyle here in north central Minnesota. So being from California, there's a lot of public land there. And here in northern Minnesota, there's a lot of public land as well. So two very comfortable places to be.
What about ruffed grouse being from California? Like, are there ruffed grouse in California?
There are. I shot my first one there.
Did you really? Okay. Northern part of the state? Or?
Yeah. So I went to Humboldt State, which is on the Pacific coast.
Okay.
And that's the Redwood Coast. And down in a canyon there in some alder trees is where I shot my first one. It was a juvenile bird. And honestly didn't know. I thought we were shooting after blue grouse, and so dusky sooty now. And it was a smaller bird. So when I picked it up, though, I realized it was a ruffed grouse. And so that was how I shot my first ruffed grouse when I was in college.
That is super cool. I mean, that dovetails, I should say grouse tails, right into my first question that I have on the list here. And that's the range of the ruffed grouse. You know, I grew up in Washington State, so just a little bit north of where you are. And my first game animal ever was a ruffed grouse. And so we had them there. But where, like, as far as range goes, like, where do we see these things?
Well, they're typically on the northern states, and then they also follow mountain ranges like the Rockies and Appalachians down into the southern states. There are also a few pockets like the Black Hills and some other ranges where they still kind of hang on. But again, typically you're looking at your northern states where you have dense deciduous and coniferous forests.
Gotcha. And you were talking about, analyzing, 800 some drumming logs. Now, these weren't, logs like documents, right? I mean, these are physical logs, correct?
Yeah, we should refer to them as drumming structures. So these birds, when they do their sexual display, typically find an elevated platform and they choose a stage. They have a drumming stage that they stand on. And so the region that I was in, the predominant drumming structure was logs. And so your classic drumming structure is a log for ruffed grouse. Now that I've spent a lot of time in the northeastern part of Minnesota, especially around historic mine sites, birds actually use boulders quite a bit over that way, especially in areas where there aren't too many large diameter trees. There's kind of a criteria for birds, what they kind of like or prefer for their drumming structure sizes, and so like dimensions like diameter, length, and then also the structure that protects their back. And so if they can find that on a boulder and they don't find logs, they will use boulders. I've seen them on dirt mounds, culverts, things along those lines as well.
And you're identifying these first by sound and then by sight, or by sight first and then confirming that there's a bird there when he drums?
So the way that we did the drumming surveys, kind of like how the DNR does them. So you're walking a linear path, we call it a transect, and you're listening for the birds. And so when you do pick up on a bird, you kind of pinpoint where it's at. So it's really, if you have good hearing, it's not too hard to determine or pinpoint where those birds are. You kind of rotate your head while they're drumming and get an idea exactly where they are. And then you look at the time on your watch, and then you wait for the next drum. A lot of times, especially in the spring when these birds are going, they're like clockwork. And so you might have a drumming interval of 2 minutes or 3 minutes. Especially in the morning, they're very predictable. Later on in the day or later in the season, they get less predictable. But you can actually walk very quietly and look with binoculars ahead for a drumming structure. And then right at that period of time when you expect them to drum again, you can kind of pinpoint that bird again. You actually can move pretty quick when they're drumming because they can't
Sure.
see as well when they're drumming. So that's how you locate those drumming structures. They're really not easy to find, but if you see a lot of them, you can start to pick them out in the woods when you're walking through them. And the telltale sign, if you don't actually see the bird on there, is a large accumulation of droppings on either side.
Yeah, that's the only way I've ever found them. And it's always like I'm wandering and I step over this log and I look down and it's like, oh, there's a whole bunch of poop here. Yeah. So does he stay on that log the whole time until a female comes in, or does he call it quits after a period of time, or it depends on the bird? It depends on what he's got going on.
It depends on the bird, where you're at, time of year. Even north central Minnesota, birds typically have more than one drumming structure.
Sure.
And so they have a primary structure that they really like. And if you bump them off of that structure, so you're walking in and they get nervous and they go on to the next structure, they'll try and keep their drumming interval. So they'll run to their next structure and drum on that one.
Sure.
And so you can kind of get an idea of satellite logs or satellite structures.
Sure.
The primary log tend to have a lot of droppings. The other ones have less, but yeah, they might have multiple.
So the female ruffed grouse, they're attracted to this drumming and they're drawn to it, or and then what goes on there?
So once the female approaches, the male does a display. So have you guys seen a ruffed grouse in display?
Mm-hmm.
They got their ruffs out and their tails up, and they kind of fan. And a lot of times they'll even drag their wingtips on the ground, kind of reminiscent of a turkey. And then the male displays, and even does a hissing display and ticks his neck. So if you're ever curious about that, you should Google it.
Yeah.
It's pretty kind of amazing to watch. There's a couple of fellows who have pin-raised birds, and they have some pretty awesome footage of the vocalizations and then also that close-up display.
I've recently seen those, and that was something, I remember reading like Fur Fish and Game, people talking about raising ruffed grouse and how it was impossible. And then like those videos just kind of blew up recently, I think. And they've got, these ruffed grouse in full display, and it's like, how they do that. And the vocalizations, it's like another thing. When I was younger, and like my first real hunt, like aside from a rabbit hunt or a squirrel hunt or something like that, but like go to a place and camp there and then like go out and set out for game, was ruffed grouse. And my dad and my uncle told me, well, they don't make noise. And now, like, I understand that's absolutely not the case. They actually have a pretty diverse palette of vocalizations that they'll squeak out at any given time.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And really quite interesting to watch. And that display is super dramatic. Like, we think turkey display is cool, but ruffed grouse puts on quite a show. Yeah.
For sure. When it comes to drumming, the frequency of the sound created, like if you're close to it, like I feel like you can feel it in your chest, and I almost confuse it with my heartbeat in a way. Like I'm like, is something going on here? Like I swear the frequency is nearly identical to the beating of your heart in your chest. Is there a correlation there as far as like, or has anybody measured those two things to see that they're identical?
I've never heard of it, but you're right though, and it is you feel it in your chest more than you do anything else. Especially as you get close to the bird, you don't even really hear it as well as you feel it as you get close to that bird. You actually hear the wings snapping more than you hear the subsonic boom. At least I do. Everyone perceives sound differently, And so that's kind of also one of the challenges for surveying for ruffed grouse is that as you get older, you're less attuned to low and high frequencies. And so oftentimes older wildlife biologists can't hear them anymore. And some of those older folks even bring their wives or children along to try and hear
Spotters.
those birds.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it is it's a super low frequency sound. It's actually the result of a sonic boom. So there is a certain amount of vibration that's associated with that. And it's created by a vacuum that they make between their wings when they're drumming.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah. Forever as a young person, I thought they were physically hitting their chest. They're not. That's
Yeah.
it. Yep. Is there any other bird like the ruffed grouse that does a drumming like that?
I'm not aware of any that use a void of air to create sound. You know, a lot of them do use their wings and percussion in the air and their sacs and things along those lines to make sounds, but I can't think of any off the top of my head that come close to that display. It's pretty unique.
Just another tally in the ruffed grouse or the coolest game bird category.
Yeah, well, you know, like snipe winnow, but that is a vibration of their tail feathers, and the same thing with woodcock. But it's again, yeah, it's just this void of air that they create when they do that. They're flipping those wings. You watch it too. There's a weird rhythm to it that they use, and it's kind of up and down. You really slow it down. It's not very straightforward.
So now they're mating in the spring, but I have heard grouse drum in the fall. So what's the reasoning behind that?
Well, it's typically you got a male that's got an established territory, and he's advertising that he's there. That place is occupied because there's a lot of young males that are dispersing at that time. And so that means dispersal is moving from your natal area in this case, so where they were born to they're basically traveling to find an unoccupied territory that they can occupy themselves and do the same. And so to avoid conflict, a lot of wildlife and animals in general do that, is advertise the location or that an area is occupied. And so that's kind of one of the theories as to why they're doing that. And then also, they drum year round, really. It's just you may not hear them in the middle of summer per se as well as you would in the fall when the leaves start dropping again. But certainly it does ramp up again in fall when there's dispersal going on.
Interesting. We were talking about, grouse sounds just a second ago, and I had a grouse light in a tree right above me one time. And it was the only thing I can equate the sound to. It was almost like a pigeon cooing, if you will. Mm-hmm. And he's like, like kind of like that. What's going? Hopefully that translated in the microphone.
Mark, that was really good.
Do you know, what other sounds does a grouse make, and do we know what those sounds mean?
Well, you guys have probably heard them do the peeping. So, and that's kind of they're usually flicking their tail when they're doing that. They're nervous and they're walking away just before they flush, and then they make that kind of the cooing trill before they flush. Oftentimes, they make the hissing, and I've also heard them make a trilling sound when they're nervous as well. And then the hens also make a hissing and trilling sound when they're defending their chicks. But yeah, if you spend enough time around him, I don't know if I can say his name, but Steve Olenschlager, he's a wildlife photographer and also he raises a lot of different grouse species. And he's also does a lot of photography for, say, Ducks Unlimited and different organizations like that. He has pen-raised ruffed grouse, and so he always has some really cool videos of birds and their vocalizations and their behaviors in a pen. So it's not wild bird, but you certainly get a lot more pretty intimate actually footage of what those birds, the sounds they make and how they behave.
When it comes to studies, we touched on the drumming. What are there other types of studies that you've done in relation to ruffed grouse?
When I worked for the Rough Grouse Society, I was involved a little bit here and there in research, but predominantly what I've worked on is management and then education. And so I haven't done as much research work as, say, someone at the DNR in wildlife research would do. And so you'd have to talk to someone like Charlotte Roy here at the DNR to get more of the research aspects.
Gotcha. Those studies that do go on in the spring, you'll hear spring counts and things like that. What are we trying to learn from that?
Well, the drumming counts are an index, and so indices are things that we do basically every year to keep track of wildlife populations, and they're typically not a direct count. And so what that means is that you have to compare them year after year against each other for them to mean anything. And so I think it's been going on for 74 years or so. The DNR here in Minnesota has been doing these spring drumming counts. And so basically they are along standardized routes. So pieces of road, or sections of road, and I don't remember the exact distance that they are, but every year someone drives that route and listens for birds on a series of stops, and they come up with a drums per stop heard. And so that's an index that then can be sent in to, say, the grouse manager or the grouse research scientist, Charlotte Roy here, who would then compile that information and come up with an overall state average. And the idea is that it's repeatable, so you do it every year, and typically it's done by the same people. And so you have the same level. It's gradual, right? You lose your hearing theoretically gradually. And so theoretically, year after year, those same routes are done by the same scientists or the same observers, and it's fairly consistent. So you should be able to detect changes over time in populations. Now, that doesn't always work, because then you have people that their hearing declines, so they don't detect as many birds. Maybe they retire, and you have a young person come in, and then they hear a ton of birds. So suddenly you have a spike in one set of drumming routes, and then that can throw off the entire drums per stop for the state. So that's where you get these outliers. And so that is kind of the reality of using indices in any sort of wildlife research. But not too many things can you do a census or even an estimate on, because you can't go out and count every single bird. Grouse they're cryptic, right? They're quiet, they're camouflaged, and they live in very dense areas. And so it's not like elephants on, say, the Serengeti, where you can count every individual. So that's kind of what we're working with, and that's what they do in the spring, is come up with this estimate of drums per stop. And that loosely tracks with population cycles, as also observed at, say, the National Hunt here at the Ruffed Grouse Society, where they do have actual physical counts of catch per unit effort birds, the number of birds shot per hour. There's a whole nother set of idiosyncrasies associated with that data as well.
Sure.
I didn't know that we'd need a margin of error related to a person's hearing propensity to hear or not hear. It's like, I'd like to help out with this study. Well, we're going to do a hearing test first.
Yeah, no, that's why I would be disqualified.
Yeah.
And is that where forever and a day, like, we predicted how well our fall was going to go based on Minnesota's 10-year cycle that they were constantly publishing? It's like, oh, it's on the high or it's on the low. Is the drum survey where the majority of that is being predicted from? Like, we should be on our up cycle, we should be at the peak, we should be at the valley.
Now, do you remember 2017?
Yeah.
So that was the year West Nile or something occurred. And so there were two things that happened that year. There was potentially an outlier in the drums per stops used to calculate the state average drums per stops. And then also something hit, which we theorized was most likely West Nile that summer. And so the following fall, when we expected to reach peak, was actually quite disappointing. And that was the year we were finding a lot of weak birds in the forest. So it was also, I think it was equine encephalitis, I can't remember, that was detected that year as well. But either way, there was a disease that came in. So it was an unexpected event that was not predicted. Again, the stochastic event that, in the spring, people are very optimistic based off of that drums per stop, did not translate into better numbers in the fall. So not always the best predictor. There's a lot of different factors, especially when it comes to reproductive output, because the majority of the birds that we're taking in the fall are young birds, typically for ruffed grouse. It's not the same for woodcock. That's a totally different reproductive strategy. But on an up year, when good reproduction occurs, ruffed grouse, your ratio is going to be heavy towards the juveniles. And so that really does have a big influence as reproduction on fall success.
Sure. I still have more questions, I guess, about the count, because that's been something, and I reached out to you some years ago. It was shortly after you had swung by here and you were shooting on the range with Paul. Because I had a banner year on a low predicted cycle. Like one of the best years I've ever had in a spot that never really actually produced a lot for me. But I just kept going back there because it was like nice trails and I like walking it and it's lovely habitat. And you had said something to me that really stuck out and kind of changed the way, like when I'm e-scouting or when I'm cruising around northern Wisconsin or northern Minnesota and like trying to find that spot, that habitat is so important. If you're expecting to have a successful hunt, and then also like the weather can change everything. So like during nesting season, if you've got a bad weather and your clutches are drowned, or I think drought's hard on them. I'm assuming, right? To not necessarily put all my faith in that drum count, but really focus on good habitat and hopefully have had good weather during the spring and the summer prior. And I suppose, like, thinking about those drum counts, if they're the same routes every year and we still have like residential encroachment, or we have different forestry practices, or we have burns or no burns, depending on where we are, a route could go stagnant because the habitat just simply isn't there, right? And it's going to,
Yes.
yeah, and it's going to plummet that data.
You think about road noise, like road noise, residential noise, changes, like you said, changes in ownership, changes in management. Even you think about since the mid 70s, how much management has changed on Forest Service land. And they do make decisions to remove some drumming routes, drumming survey routes, and then add new ones in those instances. Some of these rural routes, especially asphalt surface roads, they may have been really quiet in the 80s and now they are literally a highway. And so there are some changes that have been made, but certainly it changes. And that's one of the other things you have to take into account when you're dealing with indices, or conditions in the environment that are changing over time. So it's not necessarily apples to apples when you're comparing those things. And so that's where interpretation comes in from biologists and people who spend a lot of time thinking about that.
You always hear, and we've talked about it today, but grouse populations being cyclic. So what is it about the grouse that you will see it kind of rise, hit a peak, and then fall off after that? Is that what makes their population cycle work like that?
Well, we don't know. There's a lot of theories, but nobody really knows. And I always tell everybody, when I was first started at the U, Rocky Gutierrez was my advisor, and he said that we would probably lose the cycle before we understand it.
Nice.
And so that was one of the things that we kind of thought about a couple of years ago, especially in that 2017 year. I believe that was the year where things kind of fell apart. Was this idea that, it may start to have a lot of variability, like a lot of things that have been predictable forever in humans since the written records. You think about it long term, though, we may lose that predictability and it may start to break down. And so I think generally we're going to see a rough cycle, but it may not be as strong as what we've observed in the past. But certainly we don't really know. There's a lot of theories out there between cycles in snowshoe hare populations and resulting in prey switching by increased predator loads. And that also ties into herbivory by snowshoe hares and a delayed response by vegetation. There's also solar flares and all sorts of different theories that go into why northern populations are cyclical. That certainly that predictability, that approximately 10-year cycle, is really fascinating and something that has been observed for quite a long time. So, and the other thing is that a lot of times those cycles are associated with animals that occur in northern ranges, and they tend to have cyclical populations for a lot of different reasons. But truly, honestly, we still don't really understand it, nor do we really know what drives that cycle. So it's kind of the mystery that we all can think about. It's kind of nice to have a few mysteries to think about.
Yeah. I never thought about the correlation between snowshoe hares, what they're chewing on, and then how that would impact grouse. Or what's eating snowshoe hares. If they don't have snowshoe hares, maybe they pivot to grouse.
Yeah, there's a lot of different potential, and it's probably not just one. Most of these things are complex. There's a death by 1,000 cuts when it comes to wildlife, and so there's a lot of different factors that contribute to variation or phenomenon that we observe. It's not typically something that's very straightforward.
When it comes to habitat, like what does a rough grouse need? Like, what is optimal, from poult to adult? Like, what is the optimal conditions? Like, if I was a grouse and I was like, man, if I could have A, B, C, D, all the way to Z, however many things there are, like, what am I looking for to make a go of it?
Well, number one, day to day, is structural complexity. So I like to explain structural complexity as like you put your arms out and you walk through a forest, and how far can you get if your arms are straight out? Can you move forward and keep progressing to the forest, or are you stopped right away? You think about how dense those areas are that you find a lot of birds. You can barely swing a shotgun barrel here in northern Minnesota. You got to be really careful about where you stop because you're not going to have much of a swing just because our forests are so dense here. So structural protection, structural complexity, that provides protection from predators. And that's number one, right? They have to survive the day to day. But also birds need to have everything that they need within a full year cycle within a walking distance, and so that's where you get to evenness or the distribution of different habitat types across the landscape. And so when you have these areas that are large, stand types of the same age class, same stand types, species, age, you may not support as many birds as you would, say, in a fragmented landscape. So grouse can be considered an edge species in some cases. And so a lot of times that's why you see when people are trying to manage for ruffed grouse on smaller ownerships, they're cutting like a 5-acre block at a time and rotating that cut across the ownership so that they can kind of diversify that landscape and support more birds. But when you think of evenness, if you need 3 habitat types in one area to support one individual, and if you have the majority of the area as one habitat type and you have 2 sections of the other 2, maybe you only support 1 bird. But if you had it spread out, and then those birds within their territories can find everything that they need, or their home ranges, you can support more birds. It's kind of a real general concept in wildlife and management. But again, it depends on the complexity of the landscape and that they can find everything that they need. And again, it starts with day one, is structural complexity. There's increased mortality rates, especially for hens in, say, places like southeastern Minnesota, southwestern Wisconsin, the driftless region, where that forest has undergone amesification, so we don't have the burning and the grazing and the structural complexity that was there during early European settlement, Native Americans prior to that burning. And then now we have, say, maple basswood that's taking over that forest because there's lack of fire. And then you get to open understory, there's no structural complexity. Birds tend to be more vulnerable to predations, basically. So again, that's you're looking at that. The day-to-day, what they need is, 1 is protection, and then 2 is everything that they need in a year to survive. And depending on where you are in their range, that varies. But ultimately, there's a need for structural protection because everything likes to eat a ruffed grouse. They are number 1 on the list if they have anything as an option.
Quite delicious.
I was going to say that includes us.
Yeah.
Talking about, what they need, but also like, what do they need to have a successful nest? To have like, what types of weather conditions are optimal? As far as creating some of that habitat for them. Maybe increasing bug life, access to water, but not too much water. What's going on there?
Well, you start with the conditions. So, for example, there have been years where we had a dry spring, and I found hens nesting in like swales that would then later support water. So, in that case, if you have a dry spring and then followed by a wet pulse in like early June when everybody's established their nests, and then it gets the water levels high, the percentage of those nests will be swamped out. The other is obviously habitat. Hens do use kind of a slightly different habitat on average. A lot of times they are using a little bit older stands than the males are using for drumming structure. And those hens are nesting typically with their back at a stump or at a bole of a tree to have something at their back for protection. But so that habitat is slightly different. Again, that's where you have diversity of age classes on the landscape. It's not just young forests that grouse need. They do need older forests interspersed in there and access to those transition zones. And then, of course, ruffed grouse chicks are they're precocial, so they're born like a chicken. They're fluffy and they walk around and they can feed themselves, but they're not really good at thermoregulating the first couple of really week and a half, 2 weeks. You imagine when you walk across the lawn with your feet, maybe you're wearing Crocs on the lawn early in the morning, and that dew gets on your toes in early June, it kind of chills your feet a little bit. But if you imagine you're, size of a marshmallow and your surface area to volume ratio is pretty high, so you're going to chill down pretty quick. So those hens end up spending more time brooding chicks, and then the hen moves along, and at first she leads the chicks, and they kind of generally follow her, and eventually she's following them. that they do lose a fair amount of chicks that way just by cooling and wetting. And then after that, obviously, it's insects, if there's enough for them to eat, because those younger birds are typically eating a lot of protein and fats that comes from insects. And so if there's enough for them to eat, again, if it's too dry versus too wet, especially with woodcock, that's a totally different subject. But, the moisture availability has a lot to do with that. And then, again, when they get a little bit bigger, they can handle bigger rain events. But the big, heavy rain events in June can have a toll on their first nesting attempt. They will re-nest it later on in the season if they lose their clutch or their nest early. But that second re-nest attempt has typically got smaller counts, so less eggs. And then the hen has less energy to put towards those chicks too, because she's already invested a lot of physical energy in that first nest.
And so is she bringing that clutch to areas that we would expect to have a higher like insect count, or is it just random foraging through the woods? She has to eat, so they tag along, and any grub or grasshopper or cricket they find is fair game.
Yeah, I don't honestly know much about hen's selection of habitat for juveniles, but you do tend to find them in younger, more open stands, like early regen stands, and areas with a lot of sunlight hitting the forest floor, but still a lot of structural complexity. And so, especially you see them early on, and then midsummer you don't see them, and you start to see them again in fall. But you do see a lot of hens along roadsides with little chicks early in the season. And that also, that's attracting them to a road edge, which is an open corridor for avian predator ambush. And so there's a catch-22 there. But
Everything
I honestly don't
tries
know
to kill
enough
them.
about their selection. Yes, every step. That's why they're paranoid.
Yeah. I mean, wet grass tries to kill them. Kestrels try to kill them. I try to kill them. That's wild.
The life of a rough grouse.
It's perilous, man.
It's stressful.
The good news is once they're airborne, I'll tell you what, you got to be on your game with a shotgun to kill them.
This is true.
Yeah.
When it comes to their diet, is it pretty diverse?
Yeah, and it's seasonal. So one of the things you mentioned earlier was droppings or poop on the log. You can literally see the change from winter diet to spring into summer diet if you follow the same drumming log. So the winter diet's typically heavy, especially within the area that supports aspen trees. You'll find droppings that are predominantly composed of catkins from aspen, so male aspen trees. There's a lot of pollen in there. And then when those aspen trees flower, they have a purple hair that's on the outside of the catkins. Those droppings actually turn purple.
Okay.
And they kind of look purple or silvery because those hairs from the catkins are then on them. And then when we start to get a green up around here, the droppings turn green because the birds will switch to those succulent new green things. And then they eat a lot of green stuff, and they think grouse. So grouse junk food being things like berries. It's not junk food. It's just a term people used to use. Berries and anything that ripens, they're going to eat pretty much anything, just like a turkey or a pheasant, very wide range of food. And then as fall approaches and the vegetation starts to harden off and even senesce, so when the leaves start to turn, the birds are going to focus again on greens like clovers and herbaceous plants on the understory. They even start to eat mushrooms quite a bit in the fall. I don't know if you've noticed that when you're hunting them. Obviously, in areas where there's acorns, they eat acorns.
Yeah, I've never split a crop and found mushrooms. I've split a crop and found acorns, which I thought was cool.
Okay.
Because everybody was talking about, you'll never kill one unless there's, just finger to maybe, 3-inch diameter aspens around. And I've killed rough grouse in all kinds of different country that shouldn't have them. Maple forests, little isolated pockets of oak and dogwood. I found a fair amount of dogwood berries in them. And then when it hasn't frozen off yet, wild strawberry, the flower or the leaves.
Leaves.
And, yeah.
Yep.
And then a lot of clover. So it's always a kick when I get one and I split its crop to see what's in there. And it's an amalgamation of so many things. It's not necessarily one thing in particular, but I do have a couple of spots that for years, lots of dogwood. Those seem to always produce birds, and then little patches of wild strawberry here and there seem to do well. But Yeah, I suppose do they still eat insects when they're in an adult phase? Or do they just
Yeah, when they
predominantly?
can, I mean, they're going to take it when they can. They're probably not as fixated on it because they can eat a lot more than say the juvenile birds can. But I don't think that you're going to see them pass up on an opportunity when it presents itself. And the biggest thing is that they switch into a different diet for winter, and so that's a hard switch when the ground freezes and the snow comes.
Yeah, mountain ash. That's another good one too. I find a lot of birds around mountain ash.
Yeah, with the berries, yeah.
Yeah.
But it is interesting you mentioned that, they're often found in places you're not stereotypically supposed to find them, and there are other things that are drawing them areas and not. One of the things that I find a lot of times is they eat hazel catkins here and also alder and birch in this area. I've also seen them eating ironwood catkins before. And so it does vary quite a bit. And like you said, you'll find them in places they're not supposed to be, where we don't stereotypically think of
Yeah.
grouse
The book on
hunting.
how
So yeah.
to the book on how to find
hmm
them maybe omits that. Maybe it's a conspiracy.
It could be.
Yeah.
You mentioned alders. Most of my grouse experience is in the Pacific Northwest, and man, you're going down a logging road, and you get to maybe a hard bend in the road, and there's some water coming out of a culvert, and you've got some alders lining the road, some pea gravel in there,
Dude, you're getting my spidey senses are tingling.
a little bit of shade, and like whenever I hit one of those corners, I'm like, oh man, this looks grousey. And I'd say about 50% of the time there is a grouse in that corner. So there's my hot tip of the day. But what's going on there? Is that just converging habitats and water and all the things all in one that a bird needs and they like to be there? Do you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's just you've got kind of the mix of what they need. Funny you say that because when I was in Idaho a couple of years ago, that's literally where I saw a ruffed grouse was on a bend with a culvert in a wet area with some alders in the shade, and the bird was standing right in the road. So it's exactly that way. But yeah, I mean, you think about, at least I'm from California, so our understory there in the conifers are typically, it's pretty open, up in the mountains. But when you get down the creeks, that's where you get that denser, you get the alder and the willows and all that denser habitat. And there's also a lot more succulent food down there, at least in California. Washington's a lot greener than California is, but yeah, it's just a combination. And again, I kind of tell people the story too about when I was working with sage grouse, someone was laughing at a biologist in another state for describing nesting habitat as something completely different than the state we are in. And but the reality is that that's a different habitat type. So yeah, that is in that state what those birds need. And so what works in northern Minnesota for a ruffed grouse doesn't necessarily what you need in, say, California, Oregon, Washington, or what you would need, say, in New York or the Appalachians. It's going to vary. There's going to be a wide range of variability there. So it's not a cookbook. This is the information and knowledge that I have is very specific to northern Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And so, again, that's an interesting thing because, a lot of people overlook that. And that, unfortunately, I think a lot of people miss the opportunity for grouse hunting because it's so centric on the upper Midwest and the East Coast. And reality is that there's a lot of opportunities elsewhere. You just have to hike harder. Hunting in Washington and Oregon and Idaho and Montana is a lot harder than it is here in the upper Midwest because you're getting more of a workout there.
Sure. Have you done any work in the Black Hills on any of those birds? Either like hunting
No, I
them
haven't.
Okay.
Nope.
They're on my list just because it's such a unique biome in the middle of nowhere. And I've never seen one out there. I've been out there a lot. And as you're describing those, that California terrain where when you're at the upper elevations is fairly open pine, very, very little understory. But as you get into these small creek bottoms and small river bottoms, it becomes dense, right? And you're like, oh yeah, this looks grousey. Yeah. And, if you get on like eBird, for instance, you'll see people reporting ruffed grouse all along, Needles Highway or whatever places once they get to these lower elevations or accessible points that people might see one. And I have wanted to go out there and chase birds, but it looks, I think there'll be a lot of miles in between flushes.
Yes.
I think a lot of miles in between flushes.
We talked some about predation.
Yeah.
Now, Ryan, we've done some podcasts here pertaining to turkeys, talking about an increase or a rise in mesopredator populations having a direct effect on clutch success. Are we seeing any parallels there with ruffed grouse as far as, predator impact? Is that increasing over time as populations show a general increase, or is that
You know, I
different?
haven't seen any research done on that. Typically, ruffed grouse is more a question. Population concerns associated with ruffed grouse is more a question of forest management
Okay.
across their range more than it is predators. Again, I haven't seen anything necessarily that has come across, and I'm not as in tune to it. It might be out there, but my experience and my previous knowledge is that it's more typically tied to forest management. Places like Ohio that are losing their grouse, a lot of it has to do with the fact that they've stopped cutting forests down there. And so when you don't cut forests or you don't manage forests, you lose that structural complexity. You use those younger forests, and then you also lose the young forest wildlife or associated wildlife that go along with those forests. But predators, it's kind of ruffed grouse have always been, a preferred food. So it's always going to be predation is always going to be something that's a major factor in their survival.
Gotcha.
When you talk about that forest management, I love hunting the BWCA just because it's such a cool place, but they don't do timber cutting. Every fire is put out, hopefully quickly. And things are generally like very old growth forest. And I found that chasing them up there, like my best prospects are edges of natural meadows, snowmobile trails, or places that have had like catastrophic weather events, like a big straight line wind comes off of like Gunflint Lake and levels a whole bunch of forest that then regrows.
And everything you described there is a form of edge habit,
Yeah. And whereas if I drive, 16 miles south toward Grand Marais and I enter then the Superior National Forest where they are cutting and where they're not intentionally burning, but I think maybe it's more people are lighting fires more often. I'm not sure, but I can get into much higher grouse populations there, or at least I have much better success there because that habitat is so conducive to keeping birds on it and keeping birds thriving. Still love hunting the BWCA. It's just a lot of walking, or can be a lot of walking to find them. Although the birds are wildly under pressured, which is nice. When you do find them, I generally stand a chance of hitting one. But how fast can they fly? Because I've heard people say 35 tops. I've heard people say 55 tops.
Wait, they can fly?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I don't know that one off the top of my head.
Yeah. They're fast.
They look really fast.
Yeah. Generally faster than most can hit.
Yeah. Yeah. What about roosting behavior? Like what are they looking for to roost? Where are they roosting? And then does that change throughout the year?
Well, that the summer roosting a lot of times is in trees, but the winter is when it's most critical. And so birds are using thermal cover in the wintertime. And so typically they're trying to enter what's called a thermoneutral zone by finding insulation that basically protects a cell of air around them that keeps insulated. So subnivean zone, getting below the surface of the snow. So a lot of times when you have what's called good roosting snow, it's like 8 to 10 inches of fluffy snow. Those birds can either dive in or settle in and then kind of burrow into the snow. And so their entrance holes are usually a good distance from where they're actually at. And those birds have a tunnel that collapses behind them, and they have a little cave that they're in, and oftentimes there'll be a little breathe hole. And those birds are in there basically digesting the food they ate prior to entering that snow roost.
Sure.
And so that's when in the spring you see these bowls in the snow with a bunch of droppings. There's usually a cecal poop in there too, so that's where they avoid their cecum right before they leave. And so those birds will literally take a crop full of feed. So usually it's male aspen catkins or any of the catkins we described earlier, like alder and hazel and birch, ironwood, anything that really produces a catkin. They'll eat that, and then they'll go and they'll digest it in that snow roost all day and then all night. So sometimes those birds are only really exposing themselves 15 to 30 minutes a day.
Wow.
When it's really cold. Yeah. So if you think about it, especially if they can eat really high quality foods here in northern Minnesota, that would be male aspen catkins. They're fairly large. You can actually see with the sex of the trees in the wintertime, the aspen by the size of the buds, because those trees are they right now they're making these flowers, and they're going to be in a bud that's then dormant over winter. And that's the first thing that'll burst and open in the spring when they can wind pollinate each other. But that tree's got this high energy packet. So those birds go up in these mature male aspen trees and they pluck or they bud those buds off, and then they pack their crop full of it, which is a storage, basically a storage compartment in the front of their chest. And then they go underground and they just digest that. And then again, they'll come out for another couple minutes, however long it takes them to fill their crop, and go back under. And so a lot of times they're really able to just conserve their energy and digest and lay low during the really extreme cold weather. And so they do really well, honestly, in the winters. That's the toughest time, but better than a lot of other species. You think about chickadees, they're the size of your thumb, the body is underneath all that fluff. And it just amazes me that they can find enough energy they can gather enough food to survive winter, whereas like a ruffed grouse has got food all around them. And same with the spruce grouse. They've got a lot of options to eat in the wintertime. So, and then the other thing is when there's not good roosting snow, they use things like grass and then conifers. So conifers become pretty important. So black spruce and balsam fir here. A lot of times they're also using bogs. So there's a big temperature difference a lot of times in the bogs because they're releasing heat in the wintertime and then basically sinking heat in the summer. So they are typically warmer in the wintertime. So a lot of times you'll find grouse around spruce bogs too. But yeah, they're basically looking for an area to get away from predators. Under the snow is great for that. And then also conserve energy. So thermal cover is pretty important for grouse, just like it is for white-tailed deer. So something to think about. But yeah, in the summertime, it's variable. Those birds have a much larger home range in the summer, and they're moving greater distances, and it's not as predictable. But a lot of times you'll find snow roosts that are pretty close to each other because that bird is using that same area.
How big is that home range seasonally?
Depends on the quality of the habitat. So if you have really high quality habitat, maybe 2 acres, but if you have really bad, or substandard, maybe it's 40, in some cases, hundreds of acres, depending on how poor that habitat is. And so poor, whether it's good or poor is relative to where you are in the nation, right? So that's very variable. But here in the upper Midwest, you're looking at, maybe 2 acres for an area that has really good habitat. And so, it depends. It really does depend on where you're at and then also the sex of the bird.
Yeah, that was my next question is like, what is the range of an individual bird?
Yeah.
That's super interesting. The snow roosting is just fascinating to me. I think it's such a cool behavior or adaptation, whatever you want to call it. And obviously very successful. And you think of people, if you need to survive in a snow type scenario, like you look in the survival books, it's like dig a snow cave, it'll insulate you. It'll keep you warm. And the grouse have figured that out.
Yeah.
And ruffed grouse aren't the only species that do that. Spruce grouse, sharp-tailed grouse, I believe the sage grouse even do that in some cases. So there are a lot of different species utilize snow roosts just to, reduce that risk to predation and increase their energy conservation.
It's a marvelous hunt that happened all at once when every bird that I saw that day busted out of one of those snow roosts, and it was
really?
Wow. Yeah, it was unexpected. I was up by Two Harbors a few years ago, and I can't remember the number of birds that came out from like an exposed. It wasn't the root ball because the tree was still standing, but it had like emergent roots, and it come and we had a big snow event maybe 2 days prior, and I was walking down this little spur trail. And like I wasn't anywhere near where I was going to expect to see grouse, and all of a sudden it was like the arcade machine was spitting out tickets. It was just and they were bombing out of there. And I looked at, I was like, well, what just happened? And I never fired my gun.
I was going to say, how many did you get?
None, not one. And then I walked the rest of that day, and I don't believe I saw a bird. I saw a woodcock, which was wild because it was late.
Oh, yeah.
And there was a lot of snow, and I missed that bird with both barrels, and I think he probably succumbed to the weather anyway. But it's pretty cool to see that. Some cool videos on YouTube too. We can watch ruffed grouse bombing out of the snow. Where guys find them either with dogs or just by happenstance, and they're a neat bird, man. They got little snowshoes on their feet.
Oh, they're just I love their feet. Ryan, you're talking about, multiple birds, and I'd say I often see ruffed grouse in groups. So is that because it's just optimal habitat and they're like, yeah, I want to be here too? Or is there a social component there? Are they a social bird to any degree?
Well, yeah, they are to some degree. They're not generally associating with each other all the time. I think that's why they're typically considered non-social, but they do come together in groups. You see it with individuals, especially when a male is displaying to say maybe one or two females or more. You come around the corner sometimes, there'll be a male displaying in a road, and there are multiple birds standing around. And then they also have loose aggregations of their broods. So they associate with their brood so that's who they grew up with, basically, late into fall a lot of times. But, even evidence in the wintertime, you see there be a male displaying and a couple other birds in that area just in their foot tracks. So I would say that they're social at times, but it's certainly not something that typifies their behavior. They don't need probably social interaction to survive, and it's something that, occurs occasionally. I've also seen them fight, which is kind of interesting. It's not too many reports of people watching them fight, but they do have social interactions.
They wouldn't be then considered like a covey like we would expect quail to be in.
No, it's kind of a misnomer. Yeah, quail need each other. And so you think about bobwhite, when you're hunting bobwhite, they say not to take so many out of a covey because they circle and they sleep together. Ruffed grouse would be just fine on their own. They do not need a group to survive. That's not something that social behavior, and a lot of quail, especially like California quail or valley quail, and even sharptail have a sentinel oftentimes that are watching out for each other to kind of avoid or reduce predation. And ruffed grouse typically don't need that. They do come together and aggregate, and they do spend time together, but it's not something they need.
Sure.
I mean, maybe they'd get lonely. We all need some company at one point in time, at least once a year, right? So, but they're not what we typically consider a social species.
Interesting. I know you're one thing, and this is just more of an anecdotal story, but one of the most curious, interesting interactions I've had with ruffed grouse was in the spring. We were turkey hunting, and we're kind of like on this, I guess you'd call it like a 2-track going through a piece of private, and we came upon a ruffed grouse, and he didn't flush, and he didn't leave, and he seemed almost curious about us, and so I just knelt down, and I grabbed like some leaves off just an adjacent plant. I couldn't even tell you which one it was. And I just hung out there, and I think I was copying whatever sound he was making.
Yeah.
And he ate out of my hand.
See, I never have that kind of fortune. Travis in our NPD team this year, he had a ruffed grouse. He was turkey hunting. This is actually here, which is cool because it's like.
Yeah, this was here. This was up in Richland County.
Yeah, and then Travis's was just north of HQ here by maybe 15 miles as a crow flies. Not an aspen tree in sight, which I thought was great. So mixed hardwoods. And he's hunting birds in the evening, and he hears what he thinks is like a hen turkey just mulling around, and eventually catches movement. And here it's a ruffed grouse, and it's wandering around, and it catches him moving, and then walks up to him, crawls on top of his gun barrel. He reaches out and touches the bird. The bird's like, "Hey, don't touch me. I'm just here for a good time." and then walked around like his shoulders, and then on top of a stump, looked around and then just meandered off into the woods. Now, I've never been blessed with such fortune to have the thing that I want to chase probably more than any other bird walk up to me. I see videos of guys on 4-wheelers. All of a sudden, they land on the handlebars, and they're looking, or they're in the deer stand, and all of a sudden, this ruffed grouse flushes up and lands on the rail. You fed a grouse.
I did, but I asked myself the question, and where we encountered this bird, like it wasn't necessarily close to like a farmhouse or a structure, but I'm like, was this bird, which I can't really think of a way where it would be habituated to people.
Sure.
But I'm like, was it somehow, tamed up in a way, or did I truly have some sort of spiritual grouse experience?
Yeah.
Meadow, please answer these questions for me.
No, I don't think that I've never seen a bird like that myself. There was one here 2 years ago that I was going to go see, and he got hit by a car like right before I got there. But
Oh my
that usually is
gosh.
what they consider redirected aggression. So it's a male grouse that, for one reason or another, redirects their aggression at other things, and so it's a type of aggression, from what I've been told or explained. But yeah, I would consider that maladaptive. That certainly would not result in a high survivorship for very long, to be behaving that way. But yeah, I've yet to have one do that. And like I said, I literally had a chance to go see one that was not too far south of town here, and he got hit like that day. But he had regularly been attacking people that were walking on that section of road.
Wow.
And so, yeah, and a lot of times they'll pull stuff out of your hand, but they don't necessarily eat it. So I was curious, did he actually eat it or did he just pull it out of your hand? Because a lot of times
Hmm.
they'll pull it and then they pretend like it's kind of like a bluffing thing, like they're eating.
You
I
know
was kind
what?
of curious about that.
It was a long time ago, so I guess I don't remember exactly if he I mean he did pull it from my hand. Like I remember that,
Yeah.
very clearly. But yeah, whether or not he actually consumed it, I guguess I couldn't say. But
Yeah,
he was
that's
drawn
interesting.
to it. He would like I would hold it out, and I mean he came and got it. Oh, that's pretty neat.
So then not only are you very in tune with what makes grouse grouse, where grouse are made, but you're also a fanatical grouse hunter.
Yeah, I mean, I've still got two good dogs, and seasons of life, right? So I've got a 12-year-old daughter now, so I don't get to hunt as much as I used to, but I still do a fair amount of grouse hunting. Last year was one of my better years, honestly, and so I've got two really good dogs, and I've gotten to the point after 17 years of wing shooting where I can hit them fairly consistently, and
Sure.
so it's
That is an
been a hell of
accomplishment.
a last year was a hell of a year. Yeah,
And
it was really a good year last year.
all in Minnesota,
What's
or did
that?
you venture into the UP or Wisconsin at all?
No, I ended up having to go back to California. I usually go over Thanksgiving. I go on a trip, but I had to go back to California on the months or the times that I normally would go on my out of state trips. And honestly, when it comes to ruffed grouse, I don't typically leave Minnesota. I don't see the point.
Sure.
I've hunted Wisconsin and Michigan, and if I'm going to hunt ruffed grouse, unless I'm going there to hunt with somebody. In particular, I don't. I mean, I live in what I would consider the heart of some of the best grouse hunting in the nation. So,
Sure.
northern Minnesota and northern Wisconsin and the upper UP are excellent places, and so it's really hard to justify leaving where I'm at to go hit somebody else's excellent places.
Sure.
And
But
what
if I lived in Ohio, I'd go somewhere else. I'd travel all over. I've got friends that come up from Ohio, and they tend to hit the UP and Wisconsin, upper Midwest here, in general Minnesota. But it's not like we have the only spot to go. But it's hard to justify for me traveling somewhere else to hunt ruffed grouse. I'd go there for sharptail or something else like that.
Sure.
that totally makes sense. What breed are your dogs?
I've got a Deutsch Drahthaar and an English setter, a field-bred English setter.
Awesome. Very cool.
Yeah.
And what shotgun gauge?
Last year I predominantly used 28 gauge. And so I used to use 20, and then I got it's a sub gauge combo. And so it's got a 20 and a 28 gauge barrel set, and the 28 gauge is just so fast. It's a
Yeah.
lot of fun. I don't know. I know that the barrels supposedly weigh a little bit more, but man, it's a quick gun and it's a lot of fun. And I did go back I tried shooting. I bought a 12 gauge, the one I've wanted for a long time. And I tried shooting that in December, and it was so slow. I was super frustrated. But yeah, you have to really, really nice gun that is fast. If you have a gun that's fast, it definitely makes a big difference in getting a chance at those birds.
Yeah, I switched to 28
And
gauge.
what I mean by that is the swing.
Yeah.
Did you?
Yeah, I switched to 28
Yeah.
gauge. It would have been 2 years ago, and I carried a smattering of 20s for a couple decades. And the gun was a challenge to get good with, like on the clays course,
Mm-hmm.
but then it paid dividends when I was in the field with it. Once I figured out how to shoot it, when you go from a 6.5 pound is a light field gun to a 5 pound field gun, it's like
Mm-hmm.
it's like you've added rocket boosters to the bottom of your shoes, and it takes a little while to learn how to control it. But my hit probability went up significantly. And birds in the bag. For the first time, I've had grouse in my freezer. I've never had grouse in my freezer.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's a super wonderful feeling to do. Yeah, it was super neat, super neat.
Yeah,
Such
it's
a
funny when you get into that. I guess before I really started hunting rough grouse, I never really appreciated a nice shotgun.
Yeah.
And then, I think the first time I shot it was a Beretta 20 gauge over under, and it was a lot lighter and a lot shorter than anything I'd ever shot before. It was kind of a game changer, and that was 17 years ago. And so now I do appreciate a really fast, really light gun because it can keep up with, you can push it fast enough to catch up with that bird versus, say, trying to fight a 12 gauge or something that's really heavy. But everybody's got their own preferences. So
I'm trying to convince Mark that 12 gauge is actually immoral and banned from hunting grouse, but
yeah. I think I think convince is a little bit soft. I'd say shame.
yeah, correct. Yeah.
At least you're honest.
And you train your own dogs too, right?
yep,
Yeah.
both of
And
the dogs I have are litters I produce too.
sure.
Oh wow.
Sure. So here's a question. I had my best grouse year last year, and couple shooters that I run around with are dog men, and they're like, well, what? I didn't know you had a dog. I'm like, I don't have a dog. And again, this is this is all my personal interpretation, and I think it depends on the dog and the dog handler, and then maybe the birds. But I think I flush a lot of birds tight because I don't make a ton of noise going through the woods, and I walk, as some people would describe, painfully slow. Whereas I see some guys burning through the woods at Mach Jesus, and I'm like, what are you doing? Like those birds, and I have seen this before, and I've had this happen to me. If I catch the bird and he can watch me come in, and he may not flush right away, he'll hunker, and then I'll pass, and then he'll flush behind me, and from where I just walked. And the slower I move, it seems, and maybe I'm just getting into good bird numbers when this happens, but I'm kicking birds at 10 to 15 yards. And when hunting with dogs, depending again on the dog and the handler, if that dog is ranging 20, 25 and that bird kicks 10 to 15 from it, that bird's out of range or into cover faster than I can get my selector off my gun to make a choice. How do you run your dogs? Do you run them tight? Do you let them range? Do you run GPS collars? Is that super secret sauce you can't divulge?
No, I will tell you, I don't like GPS collars because first off, I don't like them because I don't want to have to look at a screen.
Sure.
The last thing I want to do is look at a damn screen. I
Yeah.
pull my phone out, I look at my mapping software, I put it away. I don't like looking at a screen, and that's what people do that have GPS collars is they look at the screen. I've literally shot birds over people's dogs that didn't know where the dog was, but I had paid attention to where the dog was, and they're walking around circles looking for their dog on the screen, and it was the dog's first bird, so it was a pup. Anyways, it was one of those things where those moments like, oh, and then I had one for one season just to use or try it, and I did not like it. So no GPS units. I use a beeper collar. My dogs are pointing dogs. They see a lot more grouse than most people's dogs, so they're pretty good, even though they may be not, if somebody else had them, maybe they wouldn't be that great. There are some phenomenal dogs that are just phenomenal. My dogs have repetition. So and my dogs range depending on bird densities. I know they miss birds. Dogs that are hot or dogs that range far are missing birds. So if you have a dog that works close and slow, oftentimes they find just as many as a dog that really pounds the woods and moves far. So what I'm getting at is you talk about flushers or dogs that are ranging 15 to 20 feet or pointers that are going out 80 plus yards. It honestly boils down to your methods. If what you do is just as effective oftentimes as somebody who has, a $10,000 dog and the $8,000 get up and da 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 da. What I want to tell people is, it boils down to the method that you use and how you use it and perfect that, and it can all be effective. So what I do is my own personal preference, and there are people that would probably poo-poo. I know there are people that would poo-poo how I handle my dogs or let them get away with this or that and what I rein them in on. We all have our different ideas of what it should be. So for me, that's kind of what it is. No GPS. I use a beeper. The beeper's typically on silent. And then the dogs, I let them typically range the distance that they want to range to find birds. And like I said, if I'm in an area with a lot of birds, the dogs stay close. You get an area with less birds, they're going farther on their casts. And then I move pretty fast when the dogs go on point because those birds oftentimes are running or walking in front of the dogs. And so I run as best I can through the forest when I'm getting to a point. And again, it's very different style than someone else, and everybody that I know that's really successful at grouse hunting, they all have different methods. There is no single one method. And so I do get a little annoyed when I see people who are purists or getting after, folks for using flushers or maybe the cage of their gun. And like the idea is though, is like, well, if it works for you and it's legal and you feel ethically that that's okay, that's what works, right? And so that's one thing that's really kind of cool about grouse hunting. It's not like some methods that you have to have it really dialed in. Hell, I'm one of those people that uses a topwater popper for trout with fly rod. So,
Sure.
you're not supposed to do that, but I do. I've done that. It's just whatever method works for you within legal bounds and what your moral and ethical obligations are.
I have an obligation to shame Mark into not using a semi-automatic synthetic stock 12 gauge because I just really, really want him to bite the bullet and buy something with nice English or French walnut and a high luster blued barrel. But I agree. And like in Minnesota, you can use rimfire for grouse. And one of my favorite methods of take is a suppressed 22 pistol with a red dot on it. Because when that bird is sitting on the trail and has me busted at 60 yards, if I can get a sturdy rest, I stand a good shot of putting that bird in my bag, and I'll kill them any way I can because they truly are the most delectable of forest edibles. So yeah, I'm pretty crazy about shooting them any way I can. Are you a trail hunter? Are you a woods hunter? Are you it depends on where the birds are hunter?
Predominantly, I'm in the woods, and so oftentimes, there's old skid trails that I know that are grown in. I don't use hunter walking trails or anything along those lines. I do try to avoid people as much as possible just because, what you're getting at when you say that you use a 22 with a red dot, you like to eat grouse, and that is what you like. That's why one of your motivations for hunting, that's your personal motivation. My personal motivation in part is to get the heck away from people.
Sure.
I don't even like hearing cars when I'm hunting. And so I don't necessarily enjoy running into other people when I'm hunting. So a lot of times I'm off trail and I'm pretty competent and comfortable with the forest. And so I'll do big loops in areas that I know, where I can find cover. And honestly, as much as it's kind of taken away the mystery of the forest, having a device that you can look at coverage, even just looking at satellite imagery really helps kind of get you to go out in areas and check new areas that look like the cover type might be good. And so that's kind of the fun part. And I usually don't hunt a place more than once or twice. There's a few places I hunt more than twice in a year, but for the most part, I'm going somewhere new all the time just because I like to see different areas.
Sure. So it's the adventure for you more than it is anything else. Yeah.
Yeah, it's, I'm sure you guys can relate. There's something about hunting and even fishing, but more hunting is like you are in the moment. There's nothing else in your mind. It's 100%. You're just there. You're in that moment. And so that's kind of what I really like about it, because I'm not thinking about any of my other obligations. I mean, obviously I watch the time, but it really is a time when you can unplug and not think about all the stuff that we have to think about every day as adults. And again, another reason why I don't like having a GPS collar is because you have a screen in your interface. And I like to be able to listen to the dogs and the way they move and how they're moving and what their behavior is and how they're, you can tell what a dog's up to a lot of times just by their gait and the way they move through the forest. And you lose a lot of that when you start to include electronics. And for me, it's just that being in the moment, not having to think about anything other than just being. And so that's what hunting is for me, is that major disconnect and being able to just be and to be alone. And hunting is intimate. I do like hunting with some people, but for the most part, I like to be alone just because that's so important thing that I get from it, is that ability to just be in that moment.
No, I mean, you really hit on it. And I mean, hunting is, in my opinion, one of the few activities where a person can be truly and 100% present in the moment and everything else disappears. And the hardest part is actually the come down when you transition out of that and then you feel just the weight of, the stresses of life come pouring back in. You're like, yeah, I need to go back out in the field.
You think
Run!
you think about taxes again.
Right.
Yeah.
Taxes, responsibilities,
Yeah.
all those things. Well, Ryan, you said your piece, but Meadow, what do you, or not your piece, but your opinion on, I guess, the table fare of the grouse? Do you concur? Are grouse the tastiest of the upland birds?
Oh, I like grouse, but as far as upland birds go, it's hard to beat quail too. At least the valley quail that I grew up with. And but it's the grouse to me is something I'm pretty sensitive to taste, so I have to actually clean my birds in the field after I shoot them, so they don't get that funky taste to them. I don't know if you guys do you do that? Do you core your birds? I core my birds right away, and
It depends. If I know, and I mean, I never really know, right? So if I've slated like a 10 to 15 mile day, and it's warm, and it depends on how I hit the bird. And this is an aside,
yeah,
sort of tangential, but like I've heard people talk about how snow goose is the worst thing on the planet, or Canada goose is the worst thing on the planet, which I find laughable. And like a lot of times, I think snow goose gets its bad rap because you shoot them in large quantities and then they marinate and their digestive juices permeating all their muscles after being ventilated by a shotgun. That's why they might not taste good. Where in reality, like they eat grass, like beef, and they're lean and they're delicious like beef. So if it's going to be like a long day, or if it's a warmer day, or if I really, really pound a bird, and like I get into its guts with my shot pattern, I'm going to clean that bird right there. I carry Ziplocs on me just to do that. If it's a cool day, or if it's a short walk, or, it just depends, then I'll just throw it in the bag. I don't like to let them hang out in a bag for 6 hours. Yeah.
no, I just take I cut the vent and I just pull their intestines. So and then I rinse them out with a dog water. And I have dogs, and so they retrieve, and so sometimes even when you hit a bird well, you're still going to get a little bit of damage. And then the other one, I know this is going to put off some people. They have intestinal worms sometimes, and those will actually leave the intestines and introduce gut material inside of them. So I often feel like if I can get the intestines out right away, it improves the table fare significantly. And
I've never done that.
Yeah, I know some people disagree with me, and they don't like it because it is evidence that somebody else has been there, and so that kind of makes people bummed out. It's kind of like finding a shotgun shell in the woods if you find somebody's cored bird guts. But for me, if I don't do that, there's a percentage of them that gut content gets on the meat, and then they taste like cecum to me. That stinky part of the bird's guts, that as where they store their bacterial waste, basically. So yeah, I make a point to clean them now, and I've gotten to the point now. I used to love woodcock, and now I can't eat woodcock, and I used to like pork, and now I can't eat pork, so I don't know what the heck. As I get older, apparently my tastes have changed, and so I have to be pretty cleanly about ruffed grouse so that they don't get that flavor to them. Otherwise, I have to give them to somebody else.
What's your take on sprucies?
I'm not a huge fan of them, but I'm still optimistic that I'm going to shoot a nice male that I'm going to be able to mount for myself. So when I have a chance at a nice male, I will shoot at that bird and hope that it doesn't get damaged. And then the last couple I've shot, I had to eat because they had retrieve damage or something along those lines. So it's hard to beat that drought hard to the retrieve.
I killed my first sprucey 2 years ago, and which is funny because like the places that I've hunted, I used to hunt up in the northwestern part of the state, over by, it would have been west of Red Lake, upper and lower. And then I started hunting mostly the North Shore, maybe over to Ely, and then all the way up to, Grand Marais. And I never run into them. And like everybody would tell me, they're all over the place. Never run into them. And then I decided I was going to figure out where spruce grouse live. Did a ton of e-scouting, walked a trail, and found a spruce grouse, and then capitalized on that. I found 3 more this year. And so when I shot this bird, they have as you know, a really distinct odor. Like they have a smell. It's not bad. It's just very different. Like ruffed grouse smell a lot to me like the boreal forest. There's like a sweet rot to them, but it's like pleasant. But spruce grouse,
And by rot, you mean like almost like wood.
The leaves.
Yep.
Yep.
But spruce grouse, it's like its own thing. And I'm like, boy, I don't know. And so I actually skun that bird whole, and I put it in its own bag, and I put it in my cooler. And then when I got home and I opened the cooler, the smell of the bird came out, and I thought, oh man, like this is really not looking good. I ran into another grouse hunter then the next weekend. I was hunting in Wisconsin, and we struck up a conversation. He tours the entirety of the U.S. for upland every year. He's retired. He's got some phenomenal working dogs and really nice shotgun. And we got talking about cooking upland. And I said, well, I just bagged my first spruce grouse. He goes, you're going to love it. And I'm like, really? Because everybody tells you. He goes, no. He goes, treat it like a steak, hot and fast, medium rare at most. And it was very different than rough grouse. It was nowhere near worse than rough grouse. It was completely different though, like from a flavor profile. And so, aside from a trophy bird that I took this year, I ate the other two, and I think they're exceptional. I think like duck, for instance, will get a bad rap, especially like diver ducks. And it all comes down to prep. Like if the bird is clean, to your point, like you don't ventilate it and it's not marinated in goo. And then you cook it the way that the meat needs to be cooked, primo. I'm very excited this winter to get back up into Minnesota and chase spruces again. They do represent less of a wing shooting challenge. That is the thing. They're such a beautiful bird, super dramatic. Really don't like to flush, which I'm okay with too, because like I said, I'll take what I can get. But they're a cool bird. They're a super neat bird.
Yeah, I mean, I like to think if you like a gin and tonic, you probably don't mind the taste of a spruce grouse. They do have a very strong pine flavor in some cases.
Yeah, I don't know that I've ever had a gin and tonic.
It's not my number one.
I don't know if I've ever had.
But I've never
Tastes
eaten
like juniper. So if you know what a juniper smells like, it's what it tastes like. It's made out of juniper berries. But I'm with you on the hot and fast. The same with sharp-tailed grouse. Red meat, you gotta treat it like a steak.
Yep.
Interesting. Meadow, you kind of glossed over something there, or spoke briefly about it. You're talking about the spruce grouse and mounting it, but you're not talking about taking it to a taxidermist to be mounted. You're talking about mounting it yourself. And I was on your website the other day, and you do some absolutely stunning taxidermy.
Yeah, thanks. I do.
I mean, yeah.
I like my taxidermy.
Hashtag agree. I mean, and I consider myself somewhat of a taxidermy connoisseur, and there are all different grades of taxidermy.
Oh, yeah.
And from what I could tell, just, from the pictures, but beautiful work. So, yes, my hat is off to you. So maybe talk a little bit about that, how you got into it, what you're doing with it right now.
Well, my dad, when he was going through tech school, so my dad's from the Netherlands, and he picked up taxidermy when he was over there as a kid, and that was one of the things he did to get himself through tech school. And so we always had a little bit of taxidermy in the house growing up, and he even mounted the buck that we shot when I was 12 years old for me. And so I was interested in it. And when I job shadowed my senior year of high school, I job shadowed our taxidermist, and I messed up a turkey head, and I thought, well, I guess I'm not going to be a taxidermist. And so I actually picked up some books from the library when I was at Humboldt State. I had a surf scoter that I had shot, and it was that's a pretty good bird to learn on because they're tough. And I went and checked out all the taxidermy books, and I came up with a list and came up with a plan on how to do it. And I actually mounted that bird when I was in college. So that was, probably in 2004 or something along those lines. So that was the first bird I did. And I did a couple more while I was in college, and I did it here and there in grad school. And, just every once in a while I'd do something. And then the last 10 years or so, I really picked it up again, especially when I was teaching at the college. We needed a specimen collection. So I started doing bird taxidermy, and then I realized it would be nice to get some more professional training. And I actually went to some professional training and did some advanced bird training, life size, and then also mammal shoulder mounts. And so that's kind of where it took off. That was in the last 4 years or so. And so I started an LLC and a side business, and started doing taxidermy was at the college. And so I now work full time at a consulting firm, so I'm pulling back, but I still enjoy it. I love doing it. I love the art of it. I'm an artist, and so it kind of combines the things I love as art and wildlife. And so I do plan to continue doing it, but it's one of those things that I also, maybe when I'm retired, I can have a full-time studio where I actually do taxidermy full-time. Right now, it's on the side. I have a small client list, and it's one of those things that I really enjoy, but I don't have as much time for it. But yeah, it's a small business that I have on the side, and certainly enjoy doing it. And I joke, there's not too many things I'm like, oh, I'm good at that, but I'm decent. I think I'm pretty good at taxidermy. So
Yeah, and
I
birds
do
are
enjoy doing it.
especially. Birds are hard, thin-skinned, lots of feathers,
Yes.
lots of opportunity for damage. At the shot, in your bag, in your dog's mouth, or whatever. And that last piece that you had put up, where you had the 3 color phases of grouse, that was stunning, and they look absolutely perfect. I want to talk about that if we can for a minute, Mark.
So that was a question that I had that I forgot to ask.
Yeah. So 2 very common. I call them red phase and gray phase birds. I don't know if they have like official term. They're the same bird, right? Same everything, just color phase.
Yes. The color, so it's genetic difference.
Can a clutch yield birds of different phase?
Yes.
Okay. And then there's these interesting kind of mixes. Like one of the more dramatic birds and color phases I shot was a gray phase bird, but it had copper ruffs and it had a copper band on the tail. And then, and I've shot red phase birds that also have red or copper ruff and copper, and that's all just genetics. There's nothing super secret about that bird. Didn't grow up next to a set of power lines.
Nope, it's just like you or I, and hair color and
Sure.
things along those lines are the same species and color variation. There's other species of birds, like there's a shorebird in Eurasia called a ruff, and they have also a ruff, and it's a shorebird. But they have a wide range of color variation.
Sure.
And so it's just a genetic difference. And, like you said, birds in the same clutch, they could all be a completely different color phase and have different subterminal band colors or ruff colors. There's a lot of beauty in that variation.
Yeah.
And when, I have I put my fans up every year, and I've got bags of fans, and it's just, there are no 2 that are perfectly the same. It's kind of cliche to say, but they're all a thumbprint. Every single one of those is a uniquely identifiable bird. So that's the other thing about color phases, is they're hard to really pin down, especially the difference between a brown and an intermediate. Is that, it's just so much subjectivity in deciding on what color phase it is. Things like a true gray, a true red, a split phase, those are easy, but browns and intermediates can be a little tricky. But they did try to analyze it at one point in time using photo recognition, and it's just too complex last time they tried. And that was a while ago, so I'm sure that things have advanced quite a bit. But the amount of variation in both the subterminal bands and ruffs, and then the color phase of the bird, that is just, it's endless. It's kind of just a long gradient, a long scale of variation, and that's one of the beauty of ruffed grouse. The ones that really makes them special is that each one of those birds is spectacularly different. You can't take one piece from a bird and stick it on another bird and it'll fit. It doesn't work that way. They're kind of, pheasants are a little bit like that, but ruffed grouse are spectacular when it comes to variation.
Ah, that's super cool.
Yeah, I forgot that I shot that bird, and I've kept almost every fan from every grouse that I've shot, except those that got mangled or they were running straight away or got handled by a dog. And I was going through that fan pile the other day trying to figure out what to do with them, and I pulled out very adult gray phase bird and just the most iridescent copper band. And I'm like, what was I thinking by just it's like I was probably 15. I don't know. I don't even know when I shot it. And just a bummer. Found an owl kill a couple of years ago. I was with Bill, because Bill was talking about that color phase, gray phase with the copper ruff and tail. And we found an owl kill, or we presume an owl kill. And here these feathers were just strewn out, and he's picking them up. And he goes, "We were this close." And, yeah, that's fun.
I was going to ask, Meadow, if a person, shoots a ruffed grouse, they bring it to hand, are there ways they can look at that bird and delineate, this is a young adult, or older, more mature bird? You know, you think of like a turkey, like it's easy. Oh, that's a Jake fan. You know, like I can tell by the way it is. Like, are grouse doing anything similar to that?
Yeah, you've got young of year and you've got birds that are more than a year, and you can tell that difference. And reality is, after that point, you can guesstimate, unless the bird is banded or marked, physically, permanently marked in some form or manner, you can't tell the age of the bird. But you can tell the younger year birds from the adult birds based off of wingtip wear, the outer two primaries. I actually have a YouTube video on it that's out there that I made for, I think it was like when during COVID times or something, I made it for a college lab. But it's on YouTube, and I have it for woodcock. Nope, I have it for white-tailed deer for aging, tooth aging, and then the ruffed grouse aging. And so if you look at that, there's aging and sexing on that YouTube video. That'll break down the feather wear patterns and the feather patterns on their back that you use for sexing and aging of those birds.
Cool. We might have to like try and provide a link to that or something.
Only shoot those year-old birds, Mark, when they flush.
That's probably what I do.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, I don't know. I might be out of.
I'm just very excited.
Grouse questions.
It's grouse season in 2 months.
We're close.
I know it.
We said the other day, you're going to go. I know you're going to go.
Oh, there's no question in my mind.
I'm going to, though.
I'll drive.
I know you will, because you refuse to let me drive.
Mm-hmm.
That's weird. Meadow, anything else? Anything we missed, in regards to these just super cool birds? I'm going to say it, like maybe outside of the wild turkey, which I would classify differently, at least the ruffed grouse, blue grouse, I call them blue grouse. Those are my favorite birds. I love them.
I love them too.
What, did we miss anything? Any questions we didn't ask? Any cool factoids?
The thing is we could talk about this for days. So, there's so much to discuss. But, as far as factoids go, there's a lot. There's some really great references out there. And the other thing is that, one of the deals that we got going now is social media and all the information. There's endless information out there now, much more than, say, when I was a kid. I literally had an encyclopedia set. So, we've got a lot of options nowadays. So hopefully this helped people be a little bit more curious and lead them down the path of learning a little bit more on their own. And certainly there's a lot out there. So I don't know of anything in particular that I would touch on without starting or spurring another half-hour conversation.
I know. I just thought of another question myself. I'm just gonna leave it at that. We'll leave that one in the chamber. And Meadow, thank you so much for joining us. Been truly enlightening. They are such a cool bird, and it's just great to be able to tap into you and your experience and your knowledge regarding the ruffed grouse, and appreciate the work that you've done over the years. Ryan, anything else?
Get a shotgun. That's nice. Or whatever you got, but practice. They are fast and they are erratic and they will humble you hard.
There you have it.
That's it.
We'll end on that. So Thanks again, Meadow. Thank you, Ryan. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Until next time, happy hunting and shooting. Maybe we'll see you in the grouse woods. Bye, everybody.
Or not.
There you have it, folks. Thank you very much for listening. As usual, give this video a like if you liked it, comment something below, and give us a subscribe to the Vortex Nation podcast channel. It would mean a lot to us. Also, why don't you give us a follow over on Instagram while you're at it, at Vortex Nation Podcast. We'd love to hear from you over there, and we'll keep you updated with all kinds of cool photos and videos from our adventures that we do here. Otherwise, we will see you on the next one. Thank you again. Happy hunting and shooting, everybody. Have a good one.